Hi there, welcome to session 4 on the respiratory system or the cardiovascular system. So this includes the respiratory system. This session is loads easier, no horrible stuff about ions and depolarization. So really nice, easy session comparatively today, thankfully for you. So last session, we started to have a look at the adaptation of the respiratory system. Let me actually start slideshow if I can. 1 minute. Zoom is a bit of a nightmare because sometimes the little bar gets stuck and you can't. There you go. You can't start slideshow because it's on top of the controls of PowerPoint. Anyway, actually, let me just double check. Can you let me know in the chat if you can hear me okay? Is everything working all right sound wise? Just write that in. You hear me? Yeah, all good. Perfect. Brilliant. Lovely. So, um, we started having a little look at the upper respiratory tract, so the nostrils, last session, and we said there's quite a few things going on. We've got all these adaptations with these cells that secrete mucus. They are ciliated, so they've got these hair-like projections which move in a wave to move the mucus along, and that mucus is really important because it traps all of the stuff that we inhale in the air that we just really don't want getting into our lungs. We need to protect our lungs because they're an exchange surface. So we certainly don't want to be exchanging bacteria with our blood, for example, or virus particles if we can help it. So the more we can trap in our actual hairs, the hair-like cilia projections that move the mucus along and just remove and swallow down our throat into our esophagus, which is the tube that goes down to our stomach, the better. So that's where we were up to last session. So from there, it's relatively easy. Again, loads of words because of the labeling, but you need to treat these as a memory test, the labels, and just learn them off by heart, unfortunately. But it's relatively easy. We're going to be looking at the tube down from, well, one of the tubes down from the oral cavity at the back here is the larynx, and the trachea is the tube. So this trachea looks a little bit bumpy, and that's because it's got rings of cartilage around it. So that's an adaptation of that structure to stop it collapsing on itself, because obviously you don't want to breathe in or take a deep breath like that and the tube collapses from the pressure. So it's strengthened by these rings of cartilage. So the tube there is where the air goes down after you've inhaled. It splits into each lung. You can see there, and those tubes that split are called the bronchi. If we're talking about just one of the tubes, it's a bronchus. So you can see there, the right bronchus is labeled up on the diagram. It's the same as the heart. You're looking at the patient in front of you, so it's their right-hand side. The bronchi split then into progressively smaller tubes. You can see these on this side of the diagram. They branch, we say they branch out because it looks like branches. As I said earlier in the course, you see that branching loads in biology. It's the best way to cover a large area, a large volume. So it's really familiar in like the lungs, in blood vessels, in trees. You see it everywhere. So at the end of these bronchioles, this is the site that we're really interested in. We've got these little structures called alveoli, and this is the site of gas exchange, these alveoli. We're going to have a look at these now. That is one alveoli. Alveolus, I think, is the singular, actually. And you can see here, this is the end of the tube, the bronchiole, the tiny tube that branches off. And this is where the air comes in, and it contains oxygen. Obviously, it's full of nitrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide, argon, everything else that's in the air. But the main thing we're interested in is the oxygen. That will then diffuse across these membranes and gets picked up by the red blood cells. And as we've learned in previous units, those red blood cells are evolved to carry the oxygen away. So the air that you breathe in goes in through the trachea, splits into the trachea, that tube splits into two bronchi. These split further into the bronchioles, and at the end we have one of these structures, the alveoli. These are very important, site of gas exchange, and they are therefore an exchange surface. We've talked quite a lot about the importance of exchange surfaces when we were talking about the digestive system. We talked about the small intestine being an exchange surface. So there were lots of features we talked about with the small intestine that helped it exchange stuff by diffusion, and that was a large surface area, the main thing. Short diffusion distance. So the blood was very, very close to the exchange surface in the villi and the microvilli. They were only 1 cell thick. These are only 1 cell thick. Look, there's the 1 cell of the alveoli and the 1 cell of the capillary. So, I mean, I guess there's 2 cells if you count them both together, but each structure only 1 cell thick. So we've got a really large surface area because of all these alveoli at the end of all of this branching. We've got a short diffusion distance, and they're surrounded by capillaries. So we've got a really good blood supply. And what that blood supply does is it gives us a concentration gradient. That means the blood takes away, you can see here, as soon as the oxygen is diffused in, the blood goes away. That red, those blood cells, when they're coloured in red, indicates that they've picked up oxygen. And when they're coloured in blue, it indicates that they're low on oxygen. So there's always a constant supply of low oxygen blood coming through. So that keeps a diffusion gradient, concentration gradient. So there's always more oxygen here than there is in this low oxygen blood, which is constantly coming through because of the heart beating. So there's always a concentration gradient, high concentration here, low concentration here. And there's more low concentration blood constantly coming through. So it's a good concentration gradient. And remember back, quite a few weeks now, when we talked about diffusion, we said it's just the spreading out of particles from where they're in high concentration to where they're in low concentration. So if we've got loads of oxygen over here, high concentration, not much over here in a low concentration, it's always going to want to spread out until we reach a sort of equilibrium. And that's what this continuous flow of blood with this really good blood supply does. It maintains the concentration gradient. It keeps it like this. So as soon as the blood sort of the oxygen diffuses across into the blood, and you think, oh, we might be reaching equilibrium, that blood moves away. So the concentration gradient is maintained. So there's constant concentration gradient by this big flow of blood over these capillaries. So that's another feature of an exchange surface. We saw it actually in the small intestines. They had a really big network of capillaries as well. So large surface area in the intestines, it was the villi and the microvilli. Here it's these loads and loads of alveoli, short diffusion distance. The structures are 1 cell thick in both the villi in the intestine and here. And we've got this really strong concentration gradient as well. Another thing that's important with the lungs is, so here's the lungs. We've got something called a pleural membrane that surrounds them. Basically, we've got a couple of layers of tissue, and in between them, there's some fluid. It's called pleural fluid, and that allows them to slide over each other, these layers, which is really important because your lungs are expanding and then contracting, expanding, contracting. So they're moving all the time as you breathe. So you don't want any friction, and you certainly don't want them sticking to any other organs while this is happening. So we've got this lubrication essentially to help the movement of these structures. Another really important thing you can see on this diagram is they are protected by the rib cage as well. And in between the ribs, which are on this diagram, so these are the ribs here, obviously you know what ribs are, and in between there are the intercostal muscles. So the intercostal muscles help the ribs to expand, to hold the increased volume when we breathe in. And they also provide a bit of protection from just, I don't know, those organs underneath. It's an extra layer to help protect them. So the intercostal muscles are, if you're not vegetarian or vegan, you've probably eaten them sometime when you've had spare ribs. That's what we're talking about with intercostal muscles. It's the spare ribs that you order from restaurants. Okay, so I'm just going to show you this diagram, this little video of the lungs. So apologies for the ads. So I think you've got no sound actually on the videos, so I will just talk through what's going on. So there you go. You can see the lungs there just underneath the rib cage. And you can see the trachea and the bronchioles going into the lung. And that branch, and you can see there is the bronchioles. And then at the end, those are our alveoli. And those little black like mesh things around them are the capillaries. So the blood's moving through the capillaries, picking up oxygen. Those little molecules there are the oxygen. And it's going from blue to red on the diagram. It's not really blue. Some people like think it is actually blue. It's not really blue. I've told you, I think I've mentioned that before, but it's always drawn as blue when it's deoxygenated on the diagrams. Okay, so then off it goes to the heart and it's going to get pumped around the body, this blood, now that it's carrying the oxygen that is picked up in the lungs. Okay, so I'll just stop there because we know about the heart already. And I'll pop these questions up for you. So let's have a look at a couple of questions. What does the pleural membrane do? What's the function of the alveoli? And what part of the respiratory system is known as the windpipe, do you think, based on what we just saw? So you can write your answers in the chat if you want to, or you can just scribble them down, depending on how you feel about it. And I'll pop them up in a minute. Right, I will pop the answers up for you then. Well done. So the pleural membrane is there to reduce friction when the lungs expand and contract. So they're changing size, well, volume really, I suppose is better description, quite significantly. So we don't want there to be any scraping or sticking while that's happening. Prime function of the alveoli is to exchange gases between the blood. So oxygen, but also they're picking up, well, the blood is picking up carbon dioxide. Sorry, it's releasing carbon dioxide to be breathed out. And that's excretion, that's called that process. The part known as the windpipe is the trachea. So that's the tube that goes down into your lungs. So you have two tubes going down. We've looked at now, we've got the esophagus, which goes into the stomach, and we've got the trachea that goes into the lungs. So they're separate tubes. We obviously don't want food going into the trachea because we can block the passage to our lungs and choke. So adaptations of the alveoli then, because they have this sort of spherical shape, it gives them a really large surface area and they're an exchange surface. So we need to maximize that surface area for diffusion. And as I've said earlier, they have this amazing blood supply with all of these capillaries. They're like little nets around each alveoli. It maintains the concentration gradient by constantly, well, just the circulatory system is constantly supplying new blood to the area to re-oxygenate and to offload the carbon dioxide. It's very short diffusion distance, 1 cell thick for the alveoli, 1 cell for the capillaries. They're actually, if you think about bubbles that you blow when you're little, you get those little pots and dip a stick in and blow. That's about how thick they are. So they're extremely short diffusion distance. Another thing about the lungs as well is they're moist. And what this does is it allows the gases to dissolve and diffuse faster. So let's have a little look at these adaptations then. The large surface area means that if you manage to flatten out the lungs, each alveoli, they would have a total surface area up to about 100 meters squared, I've heard, sometimes quoted, which is massive. That's absolutely huge. But I think there's lots. See, if you look this up, you just see so many different numbers. What I have seen quoted more often is half the size of a tennis court, which probably is about 100 meters squared, 10 by 10, I'd imagine. So here's a really good diagram showing you the alveoli and the network of vessels going over it. So each individual alveoli, you can see the really small capillaries, the thin little lines, and then they obviously drain to the larger arterioles and arteries, which are connected to the main blood supply network there. So the oxygen is diffusing from the alveoli, so the inhaled air where the concentration is high, into the blood where the concentration is constantly maintained at a lower concentration. Carbon dioxide is going in the opposite direction because we're trying to get rid of that. We need to breathe it out. So it's going from the blood where it is in high concentration to the alveoli where it's in low concentration. So we still got this high to low concentration movement that we expect with diffusion. And this rich blood supply is constantly bringing in deoxygenated blood. It's maintaining that concentration gradient where it's low in oxygen, but it's high in CO2. And then what happens is the oxygenated blood is carried away, maintaining the concentration. The steeper the gradient, the faster diffusion occurs. So this maintenance of the concentration gradient is extremely important. And then 1 cell thick, as we have seen, extremely thin walls. They're made up of squamous epithelium, and they're no more than half a micrometer thick, so about the thickness of a bubble. And the capillaries are extremely close. If you look at this, this here is the capillary. This isn't part of the alveoli. This is a capillary. So this inner layer of cells is the edge of the alveoli, but they're pressed up very, very close with these two layers of single cells. So it really is a short diffusion distance. And this moisture as well allows them to move faster. Surface tension of the water molecules as well is really important. It also helps the whole process. The force of the surface tension on the lungs is really great, and that's another thing to consider. We'll look in a minute how the air is forced in and out. There's a lot of pressure with inhalation and exhalation, and we really don't want this system to collapse. So there is a lot of pressure there as well. Okay, so what I would suggest you do before we have a look at this is, I'm not sure how well, I can't see me, so I'm just going to fiddle around until I can see my video. Right, I can't see. I'm just going to pop that down a little bit. What you need to do is put your arms like this, but make sure your hands are actually just underneath your sort of pecs or breasts if you're a girl, and on your ribs. Okay, so make sure you can feel your ribs, and then take a deep breath in and then breathe out as deep as you can. And what you should feel then is you should feel your rib cage lifting up and out, because your hands should be on your actual ribs there. as you breathe in. And then as you breathe out, you should feel your hands coming in. So you should really feel that movement if you do that. So just do that a couple of times and then we'll have a look at what's happening. So you can feel it quite well when you do that. So during inhalation, you've got this really big muscle underneath your lungs. This is what this orange structure is on the diagram. This muscle is called your diaphragm. And it's normally sort of upwards like that in a sort of arch shape. But when you breathe in, it flattens down. So it's going like that when you breathe out and it flattens when you breathe in. So during inhalation, your diaphragm contracts, that muscle contracts and it moves downwards. And your muscles in between your ribs, the external intercostal muscles, they're called, they contract and cause your ribs to move up and out. So what's happening is your ribs are going out and down, and you're massively increasing the space available, the volume available. So what that does is it causes a pressure difference between inside your body and outside your body. All of a sudden, you've increased the volume available in your body and the air will be drawn in. You don't suck it in, it's drawn in because of the pressure difference. And then when you breathe out, that diaphragm goes back up. So it's flat because you've breathed in. It goes back up and the rib cage comes in. And what that does is it decreases the volume and forces the air back out. So diaphragm relaxes, moves up. The external intercostal muscles relax, causing the ribs to move down, less volume in the thoracic cavity, the area where your lungs are. So that forces the air out. So we're breathing using negative pressure. So during inspiration or inhalation, the muscles controlling the diaphragm contract, leading to a massive increase in volume. And this is a decrease in pressure. It's a dome shape, sort of arched up when before it contracts. And pushing this down will give a massive increase in volume. That will move in down through the trachea, branching airways into the alveoli until the pressure equals the pressure in the alveoli equals the pressure at the top of the respiratory tract. And then the exhalation or expiration, same thing, is basically it's a passive event. It happens because of the recoil of the lungs. You can breathe a bit more out. There's reserve volumes that you can force out. So you can put a bit more effort in and exert a bit more pressure and force some out. So we're going to have a little look on this video. I'll skip the video and then I'll press pause when it lets me. Okay, so there's the air going in. Look at those. Look at the dome of the diaphragm, this huge muscle there, and look at the expansion. Oops, let's go back. Okay, so muscles in the ribs, big, huge dome-shaped diaphragm underneath, massive muscle, hole for the spine to go through. And you can see it's going from that big arch shape to flattening and making loads of space for those lungs to expand. And this is the alveoli filling up with air as that expansion's taking place. So when you breathe in, when you're exercising, for example, you're going to be breathing deeper. I won't worry about that graph. Just going to skip onto that. There you go, last little bit from the side view. Okay. Right, let me just get out of this. and see what that was about in the chat. Yeah, fill the diaphragm to let more air in. Yeah, I think so was, I'm not so sure with singers because that's not really something I do, but I know with yoga, you know, when I said put your hands on your rib cage to feel yourself breathing in. I know with yoga, because I do yoga sometimes, if you put your hands on your abdomen and breathe deeply until your abdomen pushes out, that's a proper deep breath because it's you're really pushing everything down. Normally we don't breathe deep enough like that. We just breathe into our sort of lung space. But if you take a huge deep breath so that your hands get pushed out, that's a proper deep breath for yoga. So I guess it's to do with that. I don't do singing, so I don't really know, but I'd imagine it's fairly similar. Right. That's not the one I wanted to share. I'm sharing the wrong. Where's my... There, that's the one I'm trying to share. Right. Sorry about that, guys. I just lost my little PowerPoint for a sec. I found it. Okie doke. Let's have a quick look at a couple of questions. So, what is the respiration? That might be a bit tricky just yet. What is the main function of the diaphragm in respiration? Or it's probably not the best description of it, or in breathing. And what is the role of the intercostal muscles? So respiration is probably not the best term there. That should be in breathing, but they get used interchangeably, unfortunately, even by me sometimes. What's the role of the intercostal muscles? So let's see if you can think up some answers. I will just get the chat up in case you're writing your answers in the chat. Okay, good work. Let's pop them up. Okay, good. So respiration is a reaction releasing ATP energy from glucose. And the main function of the diaphragm in breathing, I should say, is to contract and relax for inspiration and exhalation. And what's the role of the intercostal muscles? They are there to help alter the volume of the thoracic cavity. That's the name of the chest cavity. I should have explained that earlier. Sorry. Right, I'm going to skip through these questions to make sure we cover everything. So, as we've said, alveoli have got a very large surface area and they are continually being exposed to the air that we breathe in. They're in the deepest part of the lungs and this can be slow moving. So as a result, if you have long-term exposure to air containing harmful substances, for example, cigarette smoke, it often leads to chronic long-term obstructive pulmonary diseases. And this is what COPD is. It's chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Examples include bronchitis and emphysema, and lung cancer is another problem. And you can also get allergic reactions producing asthma. So smoking is really dangerous because it destroys the cilia. Remember those little structures we saw in the upper respiratory tract? So as soon as they're destroyed, it will mean that all of the bad stuff that you breathe in gets down deep into your lungs. I've put this up, but I'm not going to go through it. I mean, because it's quite big, but it just sort of shows you the difference between emphysema, bronchitis, and asthma. So emphysema is usually caused by smoking. Bronchitis just means inflammation of the bronchi and the bronchioles because it's something itis. It just means inflammation of. You can see that there, look, bronchial tubes are inflamed. But emphysema damages the air sacs in the alveoli, which are the site of gas exchange. So that's really dangerous. What asthma does is it narrows the diameter of the tubes because of inflammation. So obviously that can be extremely dangerous as well. You can die from asthma attacks if they're not controlled. So during emphysema, the alveoli walls break down and they merge together, which isn't good because instead of having loads of smaller ones in a large surface area, you have fewer that are larger. It doesn't work as well. In bronchitis, where you've got this inflammation of the airways, they can get blocked, which means you're not getting enough air to the alveoli. And in asthma as well, the tubes get blocked with tightening, inflammation, mucus. It means you're not getting enough air to the site of gas exchange. All of these things is you can't breathe properly. Some of them you get mucus buildup as well. Emphysema is irreversible and you can get long-term lung damage. Bronchitis can be short-term, like with an infection, or it can be chronic and long-term, depending on how the inflammation has started. Asthma is generally reversible after a short attack. So emphysema, you have to stop smoking, but oxygen therapy is often given. You know, the oxygen tanks you see people with, it means that increases massively that concentration gradient that we were talking about because they have a high concentration of oxygen going in. That helps them to exchange gases then. Bronchitis, if it's an infection, you can sort it out with antibiotics. Inhalers will help because they help increase the diameter of those tubes. And with asthma, you can use inflammation to help increase the diameter. And also you need stuff to reduce the inflammation. So as we just said, bronchioles, the airways become inflamed, mucus builds up, difficult to breathe, damage is permanent, and the disease can't be cured. Asthma, smoking can increase bronchoconstriction. That's the tightening of the bronchioles, because this is a normal bronchial tube. So the black bit is the lumen, the sort of hole in the tube. And during inflammation, smoking, you can't breathe as well with inflammation. Look, you can see the tube bit, the black bit is much smaller here. And smoking means that mucus much often ends up in these tubes because you haven't got that cilia moving the mucus along. Smoking also cigarette smoke contains carcinogens. They cause cancer. Nearly almost all lung cancer is caused by smoking, and most leads to death. It's a very serious cancer. Emphysema, one thing it does is it joins, we said, these alveoli together. Look, you can see the healthy alveoli there, loads of little small alveoli, a massive one here where they've all joined together. So you're decreasing the surface area available for gas exchange, which obviously isn't good. Tobacco smoke really irritates the bronchi. It increases the chances of infection. It's harder to remove mucus. And again, we've got a healthy airway compared to an inflamed airway here. Look at the size of the lumen. Massive difference there, much harder to breathe. And then any mucus that's secreted further limits the size of that lumen, makes it harder for the air to get in as well. So I'll skip that so we can get on to the next bit. Okay, so let's just do a check of where we're up to. Breathing and cellular respiration, we need to distinguish between. We're going to look at cellular respiration in a minute. We've looked at ventilation, so that's getting air in and out of the lungs and the exchange surfaces. We've had a look at asthma and emphysema. Lung cancer, we're going to have a look at TB in a minute. So just going to stop sharing this one and put the next one up. And this is the last one on this topic now. Right. Right, I'm just checking. Can you see those slides on respiration now? Don't think they're shared, are they? Right, let's try again. Right. Right. Can you see the slides now? Respiration? Yeah. Okay. Perfect. So, as I mentioned, but didn't really explain earlier, this whole point of getting glucose in and oxygen, that's we were talking about the other week in our digestive system, and oxygen in that we've just been talking about now, is for this reaction, aerobic respiration. Glucose reacts with oxygen to give us carbon dioxide and water. It happens in our mitochondria, where the energy we get from our food, glucose is used for what we call aerobic respiration. Now, aerobic means in the presence of oxygen. It's breaking down the glucose molecule, releasing the energy contained, and energy is much greater if we use oxygen. And we call it aerobic if we use oxygen. What is released in this reaction, we can see the products there, carbon dioxide and water, but this is actually a massive simplification of what goes on. This is several reactions, really, massive, big biochemical pathways. So this is just the summary. But what also happens during this series of reactions is ATP energy is released, and we're going to have a look at that now. So there's the chemical equation for what's written up there. So glucose is C6H12O6. There's 6 molecules of oxygen, reacts to give 6 molecules of carbon dioxide and 6 molecules of water for that reaction. But as I said, it's a massive oversimplification. So respiration can take place without oxygen, and we call this anaerobic. And in animals, which humans are part of, we get lactic acid buildup. It's not very efficient. So the glucose isn't broken down in the best way without oxygen. Less energy is released, less ATP energy, but it means we don't die if we accidentally run really fast and use up all the oxygen in our blood. So it's pretty useful in an emergency situation. There's different waste products generated because there's no oxygen in the process. We get lactic acid buildup instead of the water and carbon dioxide we were getting before. But it's good enough to keep us alive in an emergency when there's no oxygen available. For example, if muscle cells are working really hard during exercise, or it might have been running away from a predator in our evolutionary history, and there's not enough oxygen in our blood to maintain that burst of energy. We're not just able to breathe fast enough to keep going, for example. So we do get this lactic acid buildup, but we can remove that by breathing heavy afterwards and taking on loads of oxygen. That's called oxygen debt for those of you that are keen at sport or might have got vague memories back to GCSE PE, some of you, and that will help to break down that lactic acid. So not very efficient. So there's only some energy, we'd say, coming off this equation. It's nowhere near as good. Okay, so let's have a little look at this. The energy that we release from this breakdown of glucose in the presence of oxygen needs to be in a form that can be stored. So we can't store glucose in our cells very well. Well, we can't, quite frankly. We store it as another molecule, a much less so glucose will draw water into cells. So we store it as a much less problematic molecule. Plants also have similar strategies. So we can't store glucose around our cells. So it's no good to have glucose to drive these reactions. So think about active transport. That's one thing we looked at, moving stuff across the cell membrane. That is something that requires energy. And this is the molecule that is used. It's called ATP. So it stands for adenosine triphosphate. So there's 3 phosphates, and there's a conversion of this molecule into ADP, which is adenosine diphosphate, and another phosphate. And that's how the energy is released. So that's what's going on. So the energy that's generated during aerobic respiration in the form of ATP molecules can be moved around really easily. And ATP can be broken down into ADP, where one of these phosphate molecules is removed, and as I said, that's why the name changes from tri to diphosphate, tri meaning 3, di to meaning 2. And the energy is released when this ATP is changed into ADP. It can then be used around the cell for various processes like active transport. And it's sometimes referred to as the energy currency of the cell because it's a really quick, convenient, and easy way to use and move energy. Once ATP has been turned into ADP and energy is released, it's really easy to turn it back into ATP. And so these molecules can be recycled pretty simply. So just want to show you a comparison of aerobic respiration. So this is the one we're talking about getting the oxygen for versus anaerobic, where we don't have oxygen. So aerobic respiration needs loads of oxygen. It needs to be in excess. Anaerobic respiration doesn't need oxygen. It can happen in the absence. So we use this one most of the time, the oxygen one, because it will produce around about 32 molecules of ATP per molecule of glucose. And this one is nowhere near as good without oxygen. It produces about 2 molecules of ATP from each molecule of glucose. And as we've seen, this one gives us carbon dioxide and water. We breathe both of those out. The water might get moved out through sweat or urine, or it might just stay in our body for a bit. But the carbon dioxide we remove pretty quickly through breathing. And this one produces lactic acid, as we've mentioned. So have a look at this. See if you can remember where we said this takes place. What's the main substance being broken down, and what's a byproduct of respiration in humans? The waste product. Have a look and see what you think the answer is. You can put the answer in the chat if you want, or I will, and I'll just put the video of the answers up in a minute. If you don't want to, don't worry. Okay, lost my little chat bubble for a minute. There it is again. Okay, let's have a look then. I got some answers in. Well done, you lot. 100% there, David. Well done. So this is primarily occurring in the mitochondria. Glucose is broken down, and aerobic respiration in humans, the waste product is CO2. Well done. I was going to skip through that because I want to make sure I have time to show you this. So the breakdown of lipids, carbohydrates, and proteins is, if you're breaking something down, it's called catabolism. It leads to 2 final pathways. There's one called the tricarboxylic acid pathway, and this is where carbon dioxide is formed. And there's something called the electron transport chain. So these are the really big reaction pathways that I was telling you about. These are massive big reactions with loads and loads of steps that give us the ATP at the end. So have a look over here. We've got lipids, which can be converted into fatty acids and glycerol. We've got carbohydrates, which go between being made out of glucose and being stored as glycogen. And that can be converted into something called pyruvic acid. We've got proteins, which can be broken down into amino acids. So all of this digestion of lipids into fatty acids and glycerol, carbohydrates into glucose, and proteins into amino acids, that's all happening in the digestive system. Then there are various processes that can take place that can convert these things into either pyruvic acid, which is quite an important molecule because it can get converted into something called acetyl-CoA. Again, loads of names, but just think of these as just important molecules. And lipids can get converted directly into acetyl-CoA, so can proteins. Everything can end up being converted into this really important molecule, acetyl-CoA. Then that can go into this pathway called the TCA cycle, which is a big load of reactions, which can then go into something called the electron transport system, sometimes called the electron transport chain, which I tend to call it just because that's what I learned when I did my A-levels many moons ago. So what we're aiming for is getting all of this food we eat, whether it's lipids, carbohydrates, or protein, broken down into its simpler forms, so fatty acids and glycerol, individual glucose molecules, amino acids, so we can eventually end up with this molecule called acetyl-CoA, which we can then feed into this big chain of reactions, and we end up in something called the electron transport chain. So ATP is used by cells for lots of things. I've talked about active transport, but it's also used for making proteins. So we eat proteins, we get amino acids when we break them down, and then we rebuild those amino acids into new proteins that we need. So that's really important. We also use it for the uptake of substances against a concentration gradient in the digestive tract, for example, when we're trying to pump stuff across into the blood, we use ATP. That is active transport in a way, but we also use it for muscle contraction too. It's really important. So cellular respiration has a process called oxidative phosphorylation. It occurs in the mitochondria of the cell, so it's plural, mitochondria and single. So it's obviously going on in lots of these. There's two processes that happen. There's oxidation, which is the movement of electrons along a series of compounds, which we're going to have a look at in a minute. And they exist in reduced and oxidized forms. So don't worry too much about that. Just think of it as movement of electrons, I think. For now, you'll learn about oxidation and reduction, I'm sure, when you do chemistry. But there's an end part where oxygen is called the final electron acceptor. And that's why we need this oxygen that we breathe in to accept these electrons. So what's happening is we've got electrons moving through this electron transport chain. I'm going to show you a little video of that in a minute. Hydrogen ions, we talked about ions last session, are pumped from the matrix into the intramembrane space. And then the hydrogen ion gradient is formed with a higher concentration of ions in the intermembrane space than in the matrix. And then the hydrogen ions flow back across down the concentration gradient. And that results in this ATP molecule being produced from ADP. You can see there. So we talked a little bit about ions and gradients and the flow across the membrane last session. So there's a very similar thing happening here where the sort of energy is used to create this molecule ATP. So that's where we're getting the energy from. I'm going to show you a little video in a minute, and it's going to show you why it's going to show all this process, these molecules moving. The oxygen is the electron acceptor, you can see here. And if we haven't got enough oxygen available, if we haven't breathed enough in, we aren't able to keep this process going. So that's why it's so important to breathe it in. Okay, I'm just going to show you this little video. Apologies while the ads play. I'll skip it as soon as I can. There we go. Okay, so that's the mitochondria. This is the matrix in the middle, and this is the inner membrane, highly folded again, so massive surface area. So you can see there's lipid bilayer with proteins embedded in it. So don't worry about the names of these molecules. But what they're doing is they're bringing electrons in and hydrogen ions in. You'll notice they're both charged, and those hydrogen ions are flowing across the membrane. The electrons are being transported. This is why it's called the electron transport chain. Moving electrons is essentially is like an electric current. That's what a current is, the flow of charged electrons. So we're building up a concentration gradient. More electrons coming in now. These little carrier molecules are bringing them in. And we're able to move more hydrogen ions across. Look that we're getting a buildup of positively charged particles over here. Ions, I should call them, I suppose. So high concentration over there. The electrons are moving along from protein to protein. More hydrogen ions. And then we need that oxygen. That's the really important stuff that we breathe in to accept those electrons at the end. Because if we didn't remove those electrons, the process wouldn't be able to continue. So we've removed those electrons. We've now got some water molecules as a result. Watching it as a speed up version here. If there's no oxygen, we've got a traffic jam of electrons. So we die pretty quickly, essentially, which is why we don't have to remember to breathe. So moving on to the last bit here, that's the electron transport chain. We're at this stage now where we've got a high concentration gradient of hydrogen ions. And that's a very special molecule of an enzyme. It's a special protein, which is going to make ATP. So those hydrogen ions move across, and that provides the energy for ATP to form. So you can see those hydrogen ions are going to move from a region where they're in high concentration to a region where they're in low concentration. And our ADP has a phosphate group added to produce ATP. Terminal oxygen acceptor there. And that movement across the membrane being the important step to build that ATP molecule, which can then be used all around the cell for all these different energy requiring processes. Okay. So that's the important bit at the end there, why we need the oxygen. It's hard to explain the whole process because there's lots going on with lots of reactions. And if you go on to study some biology-based subjects later, you will go into it in more detail. But let me just show you this last little bit. So carbon dioxide is formed when we respire. It's a waste product from cellular respiration. And when it enters the water, it forms carbonic acid. And this splits up into a bicarbonate ion and hydrogen ions. And hydrogen ions are basically what acid is. So you can see the reaction here. So we've got carbon dioxide plus water, carbonic acid, and then that splits up into bicarbonate ions and hydrogen ions. So this is what we breathe. This is happening in the tissues when the oxygen's getting used up. So these reactions going from carbon dioxide and water to carbonic acid to these sort of split up version, the bicarbonate ion and the hydrogen ion, they're in equilibria, so they can't be shifted by the concentrations of the they can be shifted from left to right, if you see what I mean. So they're in flux, they're in a constant state of change. So when the CO2 concentration is low in the lungs, the reaction will move to the right. So from the right to the left, and this will release the carbon dioxide, and this will cause a raise in the pH. So, going from a low pH up to a higher pH. Let's have a look. So bicarbonate ions circulating in the bloodstream, we've got hydrogen ions, which are sort of acidic. The bicarbonate ions can combine with hydrogen ions to form this again, and then that can change back to this, and then carbon dioxide from this can be exhaled. So that's one way in which CO2 can be moved around from the tissues. Don't forget, some of it can be held in the red blood cell as well. And it's all basically based on the pressure, the concentration, and this will cause movement out of this form to this form to this form. One last little bit then before we go. We had a look at emphysema and asthma. What was the other one we were looking at? Bronchitis, that was it. And the last thing we need to look at is infection of the lungs with TB. So this is a bacterium, Mycobacterium tuberculosis is its name. Causes TB. It's very serious. It can primarily affects the lungs, but it can spread to the bones. It can move around the body and affect the brain, the kidneys, any bones, not just the spine. It can pretty nasty. So it's a rod-shaped bacteria, which we call a bacillus. So that just means it's that sort of shape. It's non-motile. It requires oxygen, but it's extremely slow growing. So it's quite hard it takes 2 to 6 weeks to form visible colonies on culture media. So it's quite hard to diagnose unless if you take a sample from a patient, you have to leave it for quite a long time. And it has to be on the right media as well. It doesn't grow very well at all. It's got a waxy layer, which makes it quite hard to kill with antibiotics because it's really well protected within this waxy outer layer. It's difficult to stain, so it's hard to see as well. So it's quite a complex bacterium to find and to treat. Humans are the main reservoir of TB. So we're the main species, as far as we know, that carries it. But it is found in quite a lot of animals. It's found in cows, deer, badgers will carry it as well. And it's spread via coughing and sneezing from an infected person. You usually see it in the movies. You see people coughing into a tissue, and then there's blood. That's usually TB that they're showing somebody has caught. So yeah, primarily in the lungs. It's called pulmonary TB, but it can spread around, and then they call it extra pulmonary, which basically means outside of the lungs. If it's extra too. Yeah, it's not a very pleasant disease as well. I mean, it used to kill people. We get vaccinated in schools now. You might remember having a BCG vaccine, probably gave you quite a nasty scar. It's not a particularly effective vaccine, actually, to be honest. I think it's only like 60% or something. It's pretty low, but it's still better than not having it, obviously. So it can survive inside macrophages, which is obviously not a good thing because they're immune cells that we need to clear infection. So that's not a good thing either. So yeah, quite nasty because it can resist destruction and can survive within macrophages as well. So it can hang around when the body's trying to get rid of it. It's actually something that's quite common to see in AIDS patients. When people go from having HIV to AIDS, it's usually one of the first things that they get is TB. So we say it's the first diagnostic sign of AIDS. How come they can survive inside macrophages? Oh, I'm not sure about the biochemical pathways of that, David, to be honest. But it's not unusual. That's how HIV works by surviving and the immune system. So it's not necessarily that unusual. So with TB, the initial affection might not even be anything much. It might just be like a mild cold or mild flu. Um, and the bacteria can remain dormant and the person can show no symptoms and they reactivate later. Active TB is nasty. It causes quite serious illness. I mean, it kills you. It causes chronic weight loss, fever, night sweats, coughing up blood. It's really, really serious. Can be treated with antibiotics, but as I said, it's not great because of the bacterial structure with the waxy cuticle. So, and there are quite a few antibiotic resistant strains now, which is becoming a big problem. But we'll talk about that actually in the next unit. But we're sort of out of time there, guys. So I will leave it there. I'll just leave that up. That's pretty much what we've skipped through today. So have a good rest of your day, everyone, and I will see you soon. Bye, guys. Bye bye.